Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
Welcome back to the program. Nice to have you with us on this episode of The Law Show. Our guests are from Murphy Batista, personal injury lawyers here in Vancouver at 650 West Georgia Street, right downtown. Joe Murphy, QC, is a lawyer and partner with the firm Angela Price Stevens, lawyer and associate with Murphy Batista. Angela specializes in, at least focuses a lot of her time on medical malpractice. And we'll get around to moments of that in this conversation as well, because we are talking about brain injuries and concussions. And as it turns out, a concussion is a form of brain injury. So basically, it's all under the one same heading. We talked about, Joe, sustaining brain injuries and concussions in sporting milieus. How else do people get, Angela, identified? Car accidents as a very prevalent point of these injuries occurring. How else do people get brain injured, Joe?
Well, Sterling, you can suffer a brain injury if your head is hit or hits something. That's pretty logical. You can suffer a brain injury if without your head hitting anything, if your body's shaken and your brain is bouncing back within the skull. And the best example of that is the shaken babies,
right,
that don't hit anything, but the violent shaking causes brain injury and sometimes even death.
Yes.
You can suffer brain injury by not getting enough oxygen to your brain, and it's the blood flow that carries that. And I had a case of a pedestrian who had a terrible leg injury, and the blood she lost at the scene was such that her brain suffered what's called an anoxic brain injury, which is from lack of oxygen. So her head was never hit in that accident. The head was never shaken in the accident, but having her leg crushed caused this huge blood loss.
And so the brain being deprived of oxygen, that's now you got a brain injury.
Yeah, yeah, and sometimes in a delivery setting, delivering a newborn baby, if there's a delay and the baby's brain doesn't get enough oxygen during that process, they can suffer an anoxic brain injury. You can get a brain injury that's called focal, which means it's just one area of the brain. If someone gets shot or stabbed, that usually the brain injury is localized to one part of the brain.
Right.
You can get what's called a diffuse brain injury, which is the entire brain affected. There's a variety of things. A drowning case is an anoxic brain injury. Again, it's the oxygen that was needed that didn't get there. Right. So, yes, you can get a brain injury if your head hits or is hit by something. But there's a whole bunch of other ways in which you can suffer the brain injury that aren't obvious, but the effects are just as bad.
Angela, back to your medical malpractice work. Have you ever, in your practice, have you ever had a client or a family who had a child who suffered a brain injury of some description at birth?
Absolutely. Damaged baby cases are unfortunately far more prevalent than we would like to believe.
Really, eh?
Yes, it's that passage is the passage the newborn baby makes from womb to the outside is a relatively dangerous one, full of risks, and the brain is such it needs so much oxygen. There's only a very short period of time the brain can survive without damage, without oxygen. So it really doesn't take much. We're looking at just a few minutes, and then for every minute thereafter, more and more damage occurs.
Okay. And in those cases, when there is a case where the baby is damaged in some way, the baby's brain is damaged during the birth process, is it necessarily anyone's fault, Angela? Is there usually some negligence involved, or is it just a peculiar twist of Mother Nature in some cases?
Well, that's the million-dollar question.
Okay.
Just because you end up with a damaged baby does not mean to say that there was necessarily a negligent birth.
I thought so. Okay.
Negligently managed delivery.
Sure.
As I say, delivering a baby is full of inherent risks. So I get to deal with many potentially damaged baby cases, and of course the one thing that I'm looking for is, okay, what exactly happened, and is anybody to blame? And a good proportion of the time, no.
Right.
That's not the case. So, and going on to other matters, it isn't just a case of blameworthiness. It's whether we can then prove if something different had happened, whether there would have been a different outcome.
Right.
So, the damaged baby cases are very complex.
I would imagine so. And you're looking, I would imagine, if you're representing a client in that situation with a damaged child, you're looking for some way of providing for damages so that there would be some money to assist in this very small person for the rest of their life, because it's not going to be the normal life that mom and dad would have anticipated.
That's right. There's a huge impact on all of the family when this kind of damage occurs.
Sure, yeah.
And the needs of the baby are lifelong. Often there are arguments over life expectancy, but still it's a lifelong need for a great amount of care.
Right.
And it's rather different from an adult who stays one size. As the child grows, so their needs grow and change.
Sure.
And so the equipment that you have for a 2-year-old will not fit and meet the needs of a 4-year-old.
True.
And a 12-year-old and an 18-year-old, and you get the picture.
Mm-hmm.
So this is why the cases are usually the viable cases are usually high value. They need to be high value to be viable. There are many risks involved in bringing the case.
Joe, back to the getting a brain injury and back to a car scenario, an accident scenario. And one of the most common injuries we hear about, or we used to hear about, I don't hear about it as much anymore, is something called a whiplash injury. Your head gets snapped forward and snapped back, and, there's an impact and brakes, and your head doesn't necessarily hit the steering wheel or hit anything on the headrest behind you. It just goes through a pretty forceful snap and back. Now, people sort of write that off as soft tissue injury. Is that what it is, or can a whiplash injury, Joe, be a brain injury?
Sterling, the classic rear-end collision can cause neck and back injuries, soft tissues, because it's not fracturing bones. But there's also a risk that that same motion, that same shaking of the head and the brain can cause a brain injury. And that's very hotly contested by ICBC, because they argue, well, listen, this wasn't a huge collision. He didn't lose consciousness. How can he have a brain injury? But the measure of the brain injury is really the effect of the changes or the nature of the changes that occur after this accident. Someone goes from functioning very well to functioning very poorly, from being able to remember everything they need to not being able to remember much, from being able to go out in public and noise and bright lights to not being able to do that. So there's a whole host of things you look at. You look for the changes that indicate to you that something's different and that these changes really fit with what would happen to someone who has a concussion. And there have been cases recently where the courts have looked at, there's one in particular, a doctor rear-ended by a bus at a low speed, and the court found that he'd suffered a brain injury that prevented him from ever working as a doctor, and this is a young fellow. Mm-hmm. So it can happen. The knowledge now, and I think the benefit is from hockey and people watching hockey and seeing how trivial that last hit can be that ends a career.
Sure.
We now understand that you don't have to have someone laid out unconscious to have a serious and significant brain injury.
How does the process work? You talked about it the side of the road moments ago, Joe. How do we come to understand how badly brain injured someone is? Does it begin with the paramedic on the roadside in the case of a car accident, or maybe a hockey coach bringing a young player into the emergency ward of a hospital? Angela, how does that process work? How do we determine how badly somebody's brain has been injured?
Well, ultimately, Sterling, you look at the entire picture. So when we're building a case and when we're investigating it, when we're trying to determine the severity of the injury, then we look at every piece of information, and that is right from the first words out of the client's mouth when he or she comes to, if indeed there was a loss of consciousness, what was said, what the discussions were, what the ambulance personnel looked for, observed, what was written down, everything, right the way through to the GP or walk-in clinic notes. And then as we build a picture, basically all of the clinic records have to be reviewed. But when we're trying to gauge the severity, there's a series of testings that we put clients through, but also these kinds of cases are we really need the what we call collateral, additional witnesses. So that'll be family members, best friends, people who knew the person before and ideally afterwards, but often people do fall away afterwards. And we're trying to build a picture, not just from clinical records, which often do not tell anything like the full picture, but we're looking to build a picture of what the client's life was like before
versus
and compared
now.
to what it is now.
Right. In many cases, Joe, the person who has sustained the brain injury is the least helpful to you in the process of gathering information. Many times, I can remember you've told us this in the past on this program. You'll talk to someone who comes into the office and wants to have a chat. And so I have a brain injury, or you think they have, and you ask them, so how are you? Oh, I'm fine. I'm just fine. No problem at all. And you always ask on this program and elsewhere for when you come into that preliminary meeting to Murphy Battista, please, if at all possible, bring someone with you. And in that case, that person is going to provide you with probably a very different answer when the person who is brain injured says, oh, I'm just fine. The person sitting next to him or her will go, no, not really.
Well, Sterling, when you have that talk, how are you doing, I try and watch this other person very carefully, because sometimes they're uncomfortable about saying, listen, this is how he or she has changed. But if you watch the body language, and I had one woman bringing her husband in to see me for the first time, and she said, I've got to tell you something, and I can't say it at the meeting, but he flies into these terrible rages. And I said, well, did he do that before the accident? She said, no, not at all. And I said, well, why are you telling me now as opposed to at the meeting? She said, if I say anything like that at the meeting, he flies into a rage.
Right.
So here was a wife who, wanted to say there's terrible changes, but he was so sensitive about that she couldn't in front of him, and this was a change from the brain injury.
So did you then, based on that knowledge, that tip that his wife gave you, did you provoke something so that you could see for yourself this guy?
Not in the first meeting, no. You just want to explain in the first meeting what the process is, and you want to get the information from these collateral witnesses, the husband, wife, mother, brother, sister, coworker, friend, neighbor. You want to get that privately. You're not having that person, the injured person, sitting there listening to it.
Right, okay.
Because that would make it very awkward for these witnesses to really tell you how things have changed.
So, Angela, if you're dealing with someone who is brain injured from either a sporting episode or a car accident or something traumatic, and this person absolutely refuses to go along with the fact that they may have sustained a brain injury, I'm fine. Thank you very much, I'm fine. I appreciate your concern, go away, I'm fine. So how do you get past that to get that person seen by a professional who may disagree with how fine he or she thinks they are?
Okay, well, often it's either a case of they don't have the insight because of the brain injury, or there's an element of denial.
Okay.
They do not want to face these changes, and they do not like the idea that other people see changes in them that they may recognize in themselves but are trying to hide.
Right, okay, sure.
So denial is relatively easy to deal with. I'm a pretty direct person, so if I see somebody persistently in denial, then you gently but directly and respectfully sit down with them and simply put it to them. And you're on their side. You're not there to aggravate anybody.
Right.
You're trying you're winning their trust to be able to say, this is what I think is happening. And I've actually never had a situation over the 20 years I've been in the law that I've not been listened to when I've had to get to that conversation.
Right.
And that's not what I include in a difficult conversation. That's not difficult. It's just
to persuade someone to get past the denial.
Exactly.
Right.
It's just a calm situation where you have to say, I think this is what's happening, and it's not helping anybody, including you.
Right.
The more difficult situation is where they just don't have the insight. And again, I've not been in a situation where I've had somebody who simply refuses to go to the appointments and the assessments that I need to do the litigation. I certainly had a lot of, a lot of resentment. You know, why do I have to do this?
Right.
But we've always managed to persuade them to go, and we have a great team of experts who deal, have a good bedside manner and deal with their work in a professional way. And then we sit and go through, sometimes we go through the reports with the clients, and sometimes we're dealing with a client who's really never going to understand.
Well.
And we're dealing with a litigation guardian, and you have to ask yourself, what am I going to get, or what is my client going to get from going through those reports with them?
What's a litigation guardian?
It's a friend. It's a friend who steps in, often a family member, but it doesn't have to be, who steps in as the plaintiff, as it were, and is named in the proceedings, and it's recognised that the client just doesn't have the wherewithal. They can't give instructions, and so they need this friend to step in.
Okay. Okay, and is there a formal arrangement that the litigation guardian enters into contractually to represent this friend or his or her best interest? Is it like an executor kind of thing where you assume a responsibility?
Well, there is a responsibility that goes with it. It's not something you just assume on a whim.
Sure, of course.
I mean, at the end of the day, the litigation...
It'd be hugely time-consuming,
well,
if nothing else.
Yes, it can be.
Yeah.
But they're named in the litigation. They have responsibilities and they have potentially risks. So it's not something that you simply wander into, and you're not doing somebody a favor. It has to be considered carefully. Litigation guardians are essential in many of our brain injury cases.
Joe, you've mentioned in the past how profoundly people's personalities can be affected and changed by brain injuries, particularly traumatic brain injuries. So this is where the litigation guardian comes in to literally stand in for someone who is no longer capable of dealing with the day-to-day business of going to trial, right?
The day-to-day stuff is easy. It's when things get stressful and when things are dealing with the key issues. And, Sterling, it makes sense that no adult is going to want to willingly accept the label that they've been brain injured.
No.
Nobody does. And when you get involved with professionals, they're even more resistant to buying into that as a definition. So when you're dealing with a professional, you have to really be sensitive to the fact that they don't want to be labeled. It's one thing to have problems with your thinking skills that are from the pain you suffer, but it's another thing to have a brain injury that really affects that. And there's a real sense of mourning if you've got an adult who's worked hard to achieve success in their life, and now they've had this injury, and the expression I use, it's the injury's robbed them of their success.
Yes.
It's robbed them over time of their self-esteem. It's robbed them of their ability to deal with people. So you get someone who was so successful before, and post-injury, they struggle so much. I had one client who had a very severe brain injury. He required surgery. His post-injury IQ, post-injury, was 142. People think geniuses start at about 140.
Right.
And he was unable ever to go back to work because he had the intelligence, but he didn't have the brain's prior ability to use that intelligence to get things done, to achieve things, to organize his life. So IQ is...
He hadn't lost his faculties, he'd lost his organizational capabilities.
Yeah, the brain is like a powertrain in a car. You don't lose horsepower after brain injury, but your transmission doesn't work well or at all. So it means you can't drive anywhere. You can't drive very far, even though the motor's got the same IQ. That's another thing people think is following a brain injury, your IQ goes down, and the answer is it usually doesn't.
Interesting. Did not know that.
It usually doesn't. It's your ability to use that intelligence that is lost, not the intelligence itself.
See, you listen to the Law Show here on CIL 650 every Sunday. You learn stuff. I know I do. We're going to talk about, when we come back, we're going to talk about, okay, let's assume that some traumatic event has occurred, either in sports or in the traffic or whatever, and someone in your life is now has experienced trauma, and now there's great concern about whether this person is brain injured. What do you do? Our guests, Joe Murphy and Angela Price-Stevens from Murphy Batista, will guide us through the process when we return after this quick time out.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CIL 650.